Imagine the heat finally breaking as the sun drops low over the western hills, the whole sky turning the colour of a ripe pomegranate, and then, slowly, into a deep, star-crowded blue. You're standing in a narrow mud-brick street in a village along the Nile, 3,500 years ago, give or take a few centuries. The river is close by, close enough that you can hear it, a slow, patient sound that has been the same sound night after night for longer than anyone in your family can remember. Somewhere nearby, a donkey shifts and sighs. A child laughs, then is called inside, and you, like everyone else around you, are getting ready for the same task that closes every single day in this world. Not simply going to sleep, making sure the night and everything that might move through it does not touch you or the people you love before morning comes. Because here is the thing you need to understand about the world these people lived in, the same way you needed to understand it about medieval villagers and their salt and rowan wood. For the ancient Egyptians, the universe was not divided the way ours is, into a solid, dependable, real world, and a separate optional realm of belief sitting somewhere off to the side of it. The gods were not a Sunday matter. Magic was not a fireside story told for entertainment. The dead were not gone. They were, all of them, gods and magic and the dead alike, woven direct into the fabric of an ordinary Tuesday, present in the walls of your house, in the amulet resting against your collarbone, in the words a mother murmured over a feverish child at midnight. Chaos pressed in against the edges of ordered life from every direction, and every single day, every single night, was in some sense a small, quiet, necessary battle to keep that case held back. Tonight, we're going to walk through how that battle was fought, not with armies, with wax figures and painted eyes, with household gods small enough to hold in your palm, with spells recited so many times by so many mothers that the words themselves had worn as smooth and familiar as river stones. So let your shoulders drop, and let the last of today's light fade the way it's fading over that low mud-brick rooftop, and come with me into a world where the dark was never simply dark, and no one, not even the poorest farmer along the riverbank, was left to face it unarmed. To understand ancient Egyptian protection against evil, you first have to understand what Egyptians believed evil actually was, because it wasn't quite the same shape of idea that later religious traditions, including the medieval Christian world we've walked through in earlier evenings together, would come to hold. At the very centre of Egyptian belief sat a concept called Ma'at, order, truth, balance, the correct and proper functioning of the universe, upheld daily by the gods and by the pharaoh acting as their earthly representative, and reinforced, in smaller ways, by every ordinary person going about their ordinary life with honesty and correct ritual observance. Opposed to Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, the unravelling of everything that held the world together. The sun rising each morning was not a scientific certainty to an ancient Egyptian. It was Ma'at winning once again against Isfet, the great solar god Ra, sailing his bark through the dangerous darkness of the underworld each night, fighting off the serpent of chaos, Apophis, and emerging victorious into the dawn sky one more time. This happened every single night. It was not guaranteed. It required maintenance, ritual, correct behaviour from the living world below, and a great deal of quiet, careful vigilance. Evil spirits, demons, and hostile magic in this framework were essentially agents and expressions of Isfet, small local eruptions of the same cosmic chaos that Ra battled on a grand scale every night in the underworld. A demon lurking near a doorway, a curse muttered by an enemy, a restless and unsettled spirit of someone improperly buried. These were not separate categories of problem from the great cosmic battle happening in the sky. They were the same battle, simply fought at the scale of a single household, a single sickbed, single narrow street at dusk. This is why Egyptian protective practice, which we're about to walk through in real detail, never felt to the people practicing it like superstition bolted onto real religion. It was religion, precisely because religion itself was understood as an ongoing, active daily defense of order against the chaos always pressing in from just beyond the edge of the visible world. Let's step inside an ordinary Egyptian home for a moment, because unlike the grand temples we tend to picture when we think of Egyptian religion, most protective magic in Egypt happened at exactly this small domestic scale, tended by ordinary people rather than priests, in exactly the same way a medieval family tended their own hearth without ever needing to call a priest for the ordinary nightly work of it. Two household deities stood above all others in this domestic protective role, and their images turn up again and again in the archaeological record, painted onto walls, carved into amulets, moulded into small statues kept in niches within the home itself. The first was Bes, and if you've ever seen an image of him, you won't forget it easily. He was depicted not with the elegant, elongated, serene features most Egyptian gods carried in their formal temple art, but as a squat, bow-legged, bearded dwarf, often shown with his tongue sticking out, sometimes brandishing knives, sometimes dancing, sometimes wearing a crown of feathers. He looked quite deliberately frightening and ridiculous at the same time, and this was entirely the point. Bes protected households and mothers and above all children precisely by being too strange, too loud, too grotesque for a hostile spirit to want to come anywhere near. Egyptians believed that evil forces could be startled off, scared away, or simply repelled by encountering something more alarming than themselves. And Bes, with his wild dancing and his brandished blades and his lolling tongue, was built specifically for that job. Alongside Bes stood Taweret, depicted as an upright, heavily pregnant hippopotamus, with a crocodile's tail running down her back and the paws of a lion, an assembly of the most dangerous animals the Nile had to offer, combined deliberately into a single, fiercely protective form. Taweret watched over the pregnancy and childbirth above all, one of the most genuinely dangerous passages of ancient life, a moment when both mother and child were considered especially exposed to hostile forces, and her image was kept close during exactly those hours, painted on bedroom walls, carved into small protective wands laid beside a birthing bed, worn as amulets by expectant mothers throughout their pregnancy. Small statues and images of both these gods were kept, quite literally, in the bedroom. And this detail matters enormously to tonight's story because it tells you precisely where Egyptians believed the greatest vulnerability lay. Not the front door, not primarily, though that mattered too, but the bed itself, the place where a person lay unconscious, undefended, breathing slowly for a third of every single day of their life. Headrests, the curved wooden or stone supports Egyptians used instead of pillows, were very often carved directly with images of Bes, or inscribed with short protective spells, so that the sleeper's own head, the seat of thought and vulnerability, rested each night directly against a small permanent piece of protective magic. Let's linger here a while in that Egyptian bedroom, because sleep itself was understood as one of the most spiritually dangerous states a person regularly entered, in some ways even more dangerous than the more dramatic threats of illness or enemy magic, precisely because it happened every single night, without fail, whether you were ready for it or not. During sleep, the Egyptians believed a person's ba, one of several distinct spiritual components that together made up a living being, often translated loosely as something like personality or soul essence, usually depicted as a bird with a human head, was able to leave the body and travel, most vividly and most dangerously in dreams. This meant sleep was not simply a period of restful unconsciousness, it was a genuine excursion, a temporary loosening of the tight bond between body and spirit. And during that loosening, hostile forces were believed to have an unusually easy opportunity to interfere, to frighten, to attack, or in the very worst cases, to prevent the bay from successfully finding its way back into the body come morning. This is precisely why the objects we've already mentioned clustered so thickly around the bed itself. The headrest, carved with Bes, amulets worn even while sleeping, never removed, tucked beneath a light linen sheet against the skin. And spells, real specific recorded spells that survive on papyrus today, meant to be recited before sleep each night, functioning almost exactly like the evening prayers of a medieval household we discussed in earlier stories together, a verbal seal placed carefully over the vulnerable hours ahead. One category of these spells addressed nightmares directly, and it's worth understanding how seriously Egyptians took a bad dream, because it was never dismissed as simply an unpleasant mental event with no external cause. A nightmare was often understood as a genuine encounter, the bee brushing up against something hostile during its nightly wandering, a real spiritual event requiring a real spiritual response the following morning, which might include reciting a specific counterspell, or in more serious repeated cases, consulting a priest or a magician for a stronger protective remedy. Small wands, carved from hippopotamus ivory and inscribed with rows of protective animals and gods, lions, serpents, the figure of Bes himself, Taweret again, were kept specifically near beds and cradles across a very long span of Egyptian history, their curved shape sometimes suggesting they were meant to trace a protective arc through the air around a sleeping child, sweeping a boundary the same way salt scattered a boundary in a medieval doorway. These objects, worn smooth by generations of handling, in some surviving examples, tell us how ordinary and how repeated this practice really was. Not a rare emergency measure, but a nightly habit, tended the same unhurried way a fire was banked or a threshold swept. Let's move now to what might be the single most characteristic form of Egyptian protective magic. So characteristic that when we picture ancient Egypt at all, we very often picture this specific thing without even realizing it. The amulet. Egyptians wore protective amulets constantly, at every stage of life in enormous variety, each specific shape carrying its own specific protective purpose, understood clearly enough by ordinary people that a glance at what someone wore around their neck told you a good deal about what particular danger they were most anxious to guard against. The Wedjat eye, the eye of Horus, was perhaps the most widespread of all, instantly recognizable even today, its distinctive shape combining a human eye with the facial markings of a falcon. It referenced a specific myth, the eye of the god Horus, damaged in his great mythic battle against his uncle Seth, and then magically restored, and by extension it represented healing, wholeness, and protection restored after harm. Wedget amulets were worn by the living for everyday protection, but they held an especially important role in death as well, placed directly over the incision made during mummification, a piece of protective magic sealing closed exactly the wound most likely to leave a body, and by extension a spirit, spiritually vulnerable. The ankh, the looped cross so recognizable today, represented life itself, and amulets shaped this way were worn to draw vitality and protection against anything that threatened to diminish it. The Djed pillar, resembling a stacked column, represented stability and endurance, drawn directly from the mythology of Osiris, and was worn or placed with the dead specifically to lend stability to a body and spirit undergoing the profound instability of death and the journey beyond it. Scarab amulets, shaped like the dung beetle Egyptians observed, rolling balls of dung across the desert sand, connected to the god Khepri and the daily rebirth of the sun, and were worn as symbols of renewal, transformation, and protection against decay, particularly popular amulet to place directly over the heart of the deceased during mummification, inscribed with the specific spell instructing the heart not to testify against its owner during the weighing of the heart ceremony in the afterlife, which we'll return to shortly. Beyond these major, widely recognized forms, ordinary Egyptians wore an enormous range of smaller, more specific amulets tailored to particular anxieties. A frog amulet for fertility and safe childbirth, since frogs appeared in vast, sudden numbers along the Nile's flooding banks each year, and became associated with abundant new life. Small images of specific protective deities worn as pendants. Knot amulets, particularly the Tayet, sometimes called the knot or girdle of Isis, coloured deep red, worn especially by women, invoking the powerful protective magic of the goddess Isis, one of the most consistently invoked protective figures in the entire Egyptian pantheon. Famous in myth for her fierce, resourceful protection of her son Horus against every danger that threatened him during his vulnerable infancy. What's worth sitting with here, as you drift a little further into this ancient evening with me, is how ordinary all of this was. This wasn't the elaborate formal magic of temple priests, performed occasionally at great expense for great occasions. This was jewellery. This was something a farmer's wife might have owned 2 or 3 of, worn daily without a second thought. The same unconscious, habitual way you might wear a ring or a watch today, carrying real, deeply felt protective meaning without requiring any special ceremony to activate it each morning. Protection for an ordinary ancient Egyptian was something you simply put on with the rest of your clothes. Amulets carried their protective power partly through their shape and material, but very often that power was activated and strengthened by words, and Egyptian magical practice placed enormous weight on the spoken and written spell, a tradition stretching back to some of the very earliest surviving Egyptian texts and continuing, remarkably unbroken in its essential logic, across thousands of years. Magic itself, personified as the god Haker, was understood as one of the fundamental forces present at the creation of the world, as real and as foundational a power as the sun or the Nile flood. available in principle to anyone who knew the correct words and performed the correct actions, though in practice the most powerful magic was the domain of trained priests and professional magicians who studied and copied these spells carefully across their careers, much the way the cunning folk of medieval villages held specialized knowledge beyond the ordinary household's daily practice. Spells survive today in genuinely large numbers, copied onto papyrus, inscribed on amulets, painted onto the walls of homes and tombs alike, and they cover an enormous, almost comically thorough range of everyday anxieties. There were spells against scorpion stings and snake bites, genuinely serious dangers in a hot, dry climate where both creatures were common, recited quickly over a victim, while a magician or knowledgeable family member also applied whatever practical remedy was available, the spell and the treatment working together in the same seamless partnership we've seen again and again in every culture we've visited on this show. There were spells to protect a household against the specific hostile action of the dead, since not every spirit of a deceased person was assumed to rest peacefully, and a family troubled by unexplained illness or misfortune might well suspect an unhappy ancestor or an unrelated wandering spirit as the underlying cause, addressed through specific offerings and specific recited words meant to appease or, if necessary, forcefully banish the troublesome presence. There were spells specifically for protecting infants, recited over amulets before they were placed on a newborn, invoking the protection of Bess and Taweret and Isis together, sometimes listing with wonderfully specific thoroughness every particular danger the spell was meant to guard against: fever, convulsions, the evil eye of an envious visitor, the hostile intentions of a wandering demon passing too close to the house. There were spells recited over water before it was given to a sick person to drink, the water itself understood to carry the protective and healing power of the words spoken over it in much the same way holy water would carry its own power in the medieval households we visited in earlier stories. A striking continuity of underlying logic across two civilizations separated by well over 1,000 years and an entirely different religious framework. And there were spells for travellers, for soldiers heading into danger, for fishermen heading out onto a Nile that, however life-giving, was also home to crocodiles and hippopotamuses and sudden, unpredictable currents. Egyptians, in short, met almost every category of ordinary daily risk with a specific known transmitted verbal formula, passed down the same patient way a medieval mother passed down her knowledge of which plants healed a fever and which one nailed a Rowan cross above a barn door. Just as we saw with the medieval threshold, the physical structure of an Egyptian home carried its own layer of protective attention, built directly into its construction and its ongoing daily maintenance. Foundation deposits, small collections of objects buried deliberately beneath the corners or thresholds of important buildings, including private homes, have been recovered by archaeologists in real number, and they parallel the concealed shoes and buried coins of medieval England in a way that's genuinely striking once you notice it. Model tools, small votive offerings, protective amulets, sometimes inscriptions naming the household or invoking specific protective deities, were placed into the ground before or during construction, sealing a kind of permanent protective blessing directly into the bones of the structure itself, meant to last for the entire working life of the building. Doorways received particular attention, exactly as they did in every culture we've explored together on this show, because the doorway represented the same liminal, boundary-crossing vulnerability everywhere in the ancient and medieval world. Protective images were painted directly onto the lintels and doorframes of Egyptian homes. Bes appearing here too, sometimes alongside protective inscriptions calling directly on specific gods to guard the threshold against hostile entry. Red paint, and red more generally, carried strong protective and apotropaic associations in Egyptian belief, connected to the god Set in his more dangerous aspect, but also through that very danger, understood as a colour capable of repelling equally dangerous forces, much the way the red thread bound around a medieval Rowan cross carried its own protective weight through the same underlying colour symbolism. Entirely independent invention arriving across two unconnected civilizations at a remarkably similar conclusion about which colour belonged at a dangerous boundary. Household shrines, small niches built directly into interior walls, held the statues of Bes and Taweret and other protective deities we've already discussed, and these were tended daily. Offerings of food, drink, or simply fresh flowers renewed regularly, prayers spoken quietly in passing the way you might pause, without much ceremony, to speak a few words to someone you love on your way out the door each morning. This daily, low-key maintenance of the household shrine mirrors almost exactly the nightly bowl of milk left for a medieval household spirit, the same instinct expressed through an entirely different religious vocabulary. Keep the protective presence close, keep it satisfied, and it will keep watching over you in return. One particular category of danger deserves its own careful attention tonight, because it shaped an enormous amount of ordinary Egyptian protective behaviour, and because it will feel, I suspect, strangely familiar even now, since versions of this same belief have survived, remarkably intact, in cultures all around the Mediterranean and the Middle East right up to the present day. The evil eye, the belief that envy or ill will, even unintentional, directed at a person, particularly at something enviable like a healthy new child, a good harvest, or unusual beauty, could cause genuine spiritual and physical harm simply through the force of that envious gaze, was taken seriously across Egyptian society. This is part of why infants, considered especially vulnerable and especially likely to attract admiring and therefore dangerous attention, were so heavily protected with amulets and spells, and part of why certain protective symbols, the wedged eye prominent among them, functioned specifically as a kind of counter-eye, a protective gaze meant to meet and neutralize any hostile one directed toward the wearer. Certain everyday behaviors reflected this same underlying anxiety. Excessive open praise of a healthy child or a fine possession was approached with real caution in many households, out of a genuine practical fear that drawing too much admiring attention might draw dangerous attention right alongside it, an anxiety that would echo forward remarkably into folk customs found much later and much further afield, including, interestingly, some of the more cautious medieval attitudes toward openly praising a healthy newborn that we touched on in an earlier story together. Let's bring ourselves back now gently to that same village street where we began this evening, the sky gone fully dark now, stars scattered thick and bright across it the way they only are far from any city's competing light. The household shrine has had its evening offering set before it. The amulets worn through the day have not been removed, resting now against skin that will carry them through sleep as faithfully as it carried them through the heat of the afternoon. Somewhere nearby, a mother is finishing a quiet, familiar recitation over a sleeping infant, words worn as smooth from repetition as the ivory wand resting in a box beside the child's small bed. Outside, beyond the walls of the house, the night belongs, in the deepest layer of Egyptian belief, to Rust's own great nightly struggle, his bark sailing through the 12 dark hours of the underworld, past dangers that would make even the fiercest household demon seem small by comparison, fighting the great serpent Apophis for the sake of tomorrow's sunrise. And here in this small mud brick house on the edge of that same vast cosmic battle, an ordinary family sleeps, protected by their own small, careful, patient version of the very same struggle. A bearded, dancing god carved into a headrest, an eye painted over a doorway, a spell recited so many times it no longer needs to be thought about, only spoken, soft, half asleep, into the dark. There is something worth carrying with you as your own eyes grow heavy tonight about how much comfort these people found in exactly this repetition. They did not lie down each night wondering freshly whether they were safe. They lay down already knowing the answer, because the answer had been built brick by brick and spell by spell into every object around them, into the very walls of the house itself, long before this particular night had even begun. So let the lamp in that small Egyptian bedroom burn down now, its flame growing small and steady, the same patient way a medieval fire once burned down to embers for us in an earlier story. Let the painted eye above the doorway rest quietly in the dark, its protective gaze needing no daylight to keep doing its work. Let the small figure of Bess on the headrest, tongue out, knife raised, stand his same tireless watch he has stood every single night of this family's life, and every night before that, back through more generations than anyone in the house could name. You don't need to recite anything yourself tonight. That work too has already been done. The words worn smooth by 3,500 years of mothers saying them exactly the way you're hearing them now, low and slow and sure. Somewhere far above the sleeping house, Ra's bark is already moving through the deepest, most dangerous hour of its long nightly crossing. And it will, as it always has, as it always will, emerge again into the light before this family even opens their eyes. If this quiet walk beside the Nile helped carry you towards sleep, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap of a thumb before your own eyes close the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which old world you'd like to visit with us next. And if you'd like to keep returning to nights like this one, consider following the show so the next lamp is already lit and waiting for you when you come back. For now, though, none of that needs to happen yet. There is only the small flame settling low, and the painted eye keeping its patient watch, and the old, old feeling carried across a river and a desert and thousands of years that you are known and guarded and safe until the sun finds its way back over the hills once more. Rest now. The bark sails on without you needing to watch it. Morning will come the way it always has,